Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight. I'm Paris Schutz.
And I'm Brandis Friedman. On the show tonight,
I'm very comfortable with going back right now, and I wish we would.
parents react to the CPS plan to slowly reopen schools as COVID cases rise.
They did a very poor job at responding to our recommendations.
Controversy over the Chicago Police Department's use of force policy.
Republican State Senator Jim Oberweis on his effort to unseat incumbent Democrat Lauren Underwood in the 14th Congressional District.
We don't wear blue robes, we don't wear red robes, we wear a black robe to symbolize impartiality.
It's not just in Washington. An Illinois Supreme Court battle gets political.
I know nothing about QAnon.
How the conspiracy theory QAnon has come into the conversation during this election.
I have doctor's appointments pretty much weekly.
The long haul. Months later, after contracting the coronavirus, some patients are still experiencing symptoms. We talk with medical experts.
American Airlines plans to bring back the Boeing 737 MAX planes this year. That and more business headlines from Cranes.
Every year my goal is to stay put and just to offer more music to more kids.
And how one music teacher is providing free music lessons to students in East Garfield Park. But first, some of today's top stories. The second wave of coronavirus is officially here. COVID-19 in Chicago is spreading across all demographics, infecting more than a reported 500 people a day. And today, Mayor Lori Lightfoot threatened a return to earlier restrictions.
If we don't see a dramatic turnaround in our numbers and soon, then we will not hesitate to take the steps that are necessary to save our city, to save our residents, and even if that means going back to some of our phase 3 restrictions.
And COVID cases are also going up all across the state of Illinois. The numbers in Region 5 are high enough that Governor J.B. Pritzker announced a rollback of reopening guidelines in southern Illinois and warned about other regions.
Things have changed. Every region of the state has started to move in the wrong direction. Cases, positivity rates, hospitalizations, and deaths are rising statewide.
And there were more than 3,100 newly diagnosed cases in the state and 22 additional deaths of people with COVID-19. The state is reporting more than 347,000 total known cases of coronavirus and more than 9,200 deaths since the pandemic began. The 7-day statewide positivity rate continues to rise and is now at 5.4%. To put that in perspective, on October 1st, it was 3.5%. Well, the Chicago Elections Board is reporting that since October 1st, more than 88,000 people have voted early in Chicago. The vote-by-mail request topped 500,000, which is a record, and so far more than 197,000 vote-by-mail ballots have been returned. The Cook County Clerk reports that voter registrations have gone up 5% since March and that there are more than 500,000 requests for mail-in ballots in suburban Cook County.
I ordered my ballot back in June. I received it about 3 weeks ago. And when I hear from people saying that they haven't gotten their ballot, I tell them, wait, it's coming, you'll get it.
And Chicago Public School parents are mixed over the district's new plan to bring some students back into the classroom before the end of the calendar year, just as COVID cases in the city begin to increase again. The district announced its plans late last week, and Brandis Friedman has more on them now. Brandis, what students are we talking about? It's a specific subset here.
Correct. So for now, the district is planning to bring back just pre-kindergarten students and those in cluster programs, which are for special education students who need moderate to intensive support. Now, part of the concern, the district says, is that its pre-K enrollment has fallen significantly, accounting for 41% of the district's total enrollment loss compared to last year. And we'll get to that enrollment loss in just a bit. But CPS says the pre-K enrollment loss is especially significant in the Black and brown communities, a 44% drop for Black students and 29% for Latino students. White students are down too by 22%. Also, the district says attendance in its cluster classrooms is down from almost 91% to 82.4%. Officials believe it's because these two groups, pre-K and cluster students, are not well served by remote learning. Schools Chief Janice Jackson says these are both major points of evidence in her argument to phase in a reopening of schools, bringing in the older grades later.
But we are also going to start a process this second quarter for bringing back our elementary school students as well as our high school students. Similarly to what we've done in the summer, we will be surveying parents. We will be looking at workforce analysis to make sure that we can pull this plan off. But the message that I have to parents is that I'm not throwing in the towel on in-person instruction. We're going to do everything within our power to get our kids back in school, and we're going to do that safely.
Also, district-wide enrollment has taken the steepest drop the district has seen in decades, down almost 15,000 students. CPS says these two groups will return sometime in the second quarter. That starts in early November, and they're aiming to start bringing back elementary schools, eventually high schools, in 2021. Paris.
And Brandis, we know that the teachers union has expressed opposition to going back to in-person. Obviously legitimate fears about the safety and health of teachers. What are parents saying about this?
So parents are in a tough spot, right? Many of them are juggling working from home, if they're even able to do that, along with remote learning for their children, while dodging the virus as best they can, especially if there are grandparents or underlying conditions in the home. But we spoke with some parents who still are very much in favor of returning to in-person learning, especially for their kids' social and mental health. They feel like they should at least have the option to return, but they are worried especially about continuity.
I hope they wait until everyone is in agreement before they bring them back, because I don't want it interrupted, schooling at all. I don't want them to go on teachers to strike.
There's times when he has a headache and I have to give him Tylenol because the screen time, just being on screen, it's and my biggest fear right now is that he's so isolated.
A lot of things for parents to juggle. Brandis, what about parents who oppose going back to school?
So we heard from just this afternoon a group of 15 parent, labor, and community organizations. You can see their names right here on the screen. They're part of the GYM Coalition, GYM standing for Grassroots Education Movement. They sent a letter to the mayor today saying that the district hasn't done enough to make schools safer and mostly isn't being transparent. They especially say because the virus has been most detrimental to Black and brown communities, they should be consulted about any decision to return to school.
Those who are at the most risk should be centered in their decision. There are so many different zip codes that have triple, double times the current COVID rate. We need to understand how it's going to be safe for everyone involved to kind of send their kid to school. We need to see the plan, how the plan can be done with fidelity and feasibly.
So, for example, they want specifics on what the school's safety and ventilation standards are and what the testing protocols are, what the plan is if someone does test positive. Meanwhile, the district is giving pre-K and cluster parents until next Wednesday, the 28th, to choose whether they intend to return. In Paris, we should mention, we're going to have a lot more of this story tomorrow. Of course, we'll have Janice Jackson on the show tomorrow night.
All right, we'll look forward to hearing her further responses to this plan. Thank you very much, Brandis. And now we go to Carol Marine and controversy over the Chicago Police Department's use of force policy. Carol.
Paris, the Chicago Police Department plans to adopt only 5 changes to its use of force policies. That's 5 out of 155 recommended by a community working group assembled this summer. In a statement, CPD said it rejected ideas that had already been adopted or would contradict the city's consent decree or state law, or deemed not operationally feasible, or had nothing to do with the department's use of force policy. But working group members now are criticizing the entire process, some calling it a sham. Joining us are Robert Boyk. He is Chief of Staff for the Chicago Police Department. Craig Futterman, a working group member and professor at University of Chicago Law School. He's also the founder of the Civil Rights and Police Accountability Project. And the working group's co-chair, Arewa Karen Winters of the group Justice for Families. Thank you all for being here. Mr. Futterman, let me start with you. Is sham too strong a word for what you think this process was?
No, and I've actually heard stronger words from colleagues on words like reach justice And the reason why sham comes before, though, is that this group came about as a result of the consent decree overseeing the Chicago Police Department, and as a result of finding and giving the CPD an F when it came to engaging the community in policies required under the decree, engaging the community in seeking community input about use of force policies. And so assembled this powerful group, this diverse group, people with lived experience. The mayor announced it as an historic group to fulfill this community engagement requirement. And what we've learned was that, you know, all of us feel used, that this was basically just, we provided a veneer to check the box in the consent decree when there was no intention from the beginning, much less through the process, to genuinely engage, much less listen to or follow the recommendations of this group.
Ms. Witters, CPD Deputy Chief Ernest Cato was your co-chair of this working group. Did he vote on the 155 recommendations the department, or the 150 of the 155 the department rejected? Did he express that they were just not in line with CPD's vision when you were all meeting?
So we were having co-chair meetings. Now, I'm not sure to the extent of how many votes that he made specifically, but we were having conversations. And initially, when we first made the recommendations on the use of force policy, he and I had our co-chairs meeting. We went over them, and he's, you know, shared that there were some gray areas, but he also saw areas where he felt like, you know, the police department could have adopted, you know, some of our recommendations.
So do you, like Mr. Futterman, feel it was a sham? Do you feel used?
I'm not going to say I feel used because, you know, like I shared with someone earlier, the record of our work, the body of our work is there. We're still building capacity. You know, of course, we don't have the bandwidth that the city has or that the police department has, but we're working on, you know, what can we do post all of the work. So I want to say I feel like it was a breach of justice more than a sham, but there's still work to be done. We're by no means done with these processes.
So, Mr. Boyk, whether it's a sham or a breach of justice, where was the disconnect since CPD had a deputy chief in the room as a co-chair of this whole process?
Well, sham and breach of justice are strong words. And what I will say is we are deeply committed to having meaningful dialogue as we work through the consent decree. In fact, the consent decree contemplates meaningful dialogue between the police department and members of the community. This is the first time CPD had ever conducted a working group of this type. And, you know, we are looking to learn from this process so that the next time we do it, we can have hopefully a different process. But what I will say is this is still an ongoing discussion. The superintendent just today challenged us to take another look at the recommendations to see if there are more that we could adopt. But I think it's also important to point out that, you know, a third of the recommendations were in fact contrary or already existing in current state law that we didn't necessarily think belonged within the policy itself.
So, Mr. Futterman, let me take to Craig Futterman, because you were part of really the team originating creating the groundwork for this consent decree. Did you knowingly propose things that weren't in line with the consent decree?
No, of course not. And to be clear, the consent decree provides a floor, just like the Constitution. It doesn't provide a ceiling on what can be accomplished, but the consent decree provides the bare minimums. But what was actually proposed by this group, the core set of principles proposed by this group, are nationally and internationally accepted best practices, some of the same things that the mayor herself has championed and continues to champion, like things like that are called force mitigation principles, which basically seek to eliminate the need to use force in the first place by requiring, whenever possible, officers to try to de-escalate. And most importantly, then when officers use force, to require that officers use the least amount of force necessary. What's interesting is that the CPD says, yes, we have force mitigation policies in our present policy, But what they ignore, and this is what the group found, was that we reviewed the policies line by line, word for word, and showed exactly where the policies fell short. So things like the least amount of force necessary as requirement simply don't exist in the policy, and they need to urgently.
Let me take this back to Mr. Boyk, because Deputy Chief Cato was on that. He is a sworn officer. I know you are not. You're a chief of staff, and so not sworn. But I mean, was he coming back to the police department and saying, you know, this working group is way off base with what we in CPD think we can do? I mean, did that dialogue occur?
Sorry to interrupt you. No, nobody ever said that. Certainly not Deputy Chief Cato. I think we all recognize this is a first step toward that meaningful discussion that we know we have to have with the community and continue to get better at within the community.
I don't think this was portrayed, though, as a first step. Was it, Ms. Winters? I mean, wasn't this the culmination of the mayor's promise to bring community groups to the table to offer their long-awaited input? Was this just a first step?
It was a giant step, but I think there were also quite a few missteps. I don't think the city authentically wanted it, and I don't think CPD authentically wanted it. And I think we said coming in, if this was not going to be an authentic process, and he's talking about dialogue, there was opportunity for dialogue. They left us no room for renegotiations. It was just these blatant rejection after rejection, knowing full well that a majority of the working group were community members, were just activists, were just residents, we were not lawyers, we were not policymakers, we were just people who came into this process hoping to make some difference or make a better policing system for our city. So they did not work with us on that level, and they are still not trying to work with us on that level, and shame on them. And it wasn't just the executive steering committee that made all these rejections. He too was probably a part of the rejections, as well as, we have to remember this is a white, male, patriarchal, dominant system that probably chimed in on the majority of the rejections, rejecting and denouncing community voices, people of color, people with disabilities, vulnerable citizens who worked very diligently to get this job completed.
Mr. Boyk, last word, was this done in bad faith? Is this just a check the box for CPD?
No, absolutely not. And this process was never characterized as a negotiation. This is one in which we wanted to engage in constructive, meaningful dialogue. I will say that roughly a third of the recommendations were completely outside of the scope of use of force entirely, which I think more dialogue could have helped explain. Things like pre-arrest diversion, community oversight, independent autopsy by a third party. These things have nothing to do with use of force, yet they were front and center with respect to the working group's recommendations.
Well, we do need much more dialogue on this, and I'm sorry that this is the short amount of time we have, but I'm confident that we're going to return to this conversation. Robert Boyk, Craig Futterman, and Arewa Karen Winters, thank you for joining us on Chicago Tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carol.
Brandis, we go back to you.
Carol, thank you. 7 months into the pandemic, and some patients diagnosed early on with the coronavirus are still experiencing symptoms. 44-year-old Jamie Novick of Blue Island was hospitalized in May for the coronavirus. Today, she has lung damage and is still suffering from exhaustion.
For the first few months, if I did too much, I might be in bed for several days. Now it's not days that that I would be in bed, but it still ends up being, and you don't know how much is too much until after it's too late. And sometimes it could be immediately, and sometimes it's hours later, and suddenly you're in bed.
Known as long haulers, some COVID patients like Jamie report a range of sustained symptoms, including extreme fatigue, brain fog, hair loss, and coughing. Joining us to discuss what we know and don't know about the long-term effects of the virus are Mercedes Carnathan, an epidemiologist and vice chair of preventive medicine at Northwestern University Feinberg School of Medicine, And Leonard Jason, the director of Center for Community Research at DePaul University, he's conducting research on the coronavirus, long haulers, and has a background in studying chronic fatigue syndrome. Welcome back to Chicago Tonight. Thank you. So Leonard, let's start with you, please. Throughout your research, you've had long haulers call about their experiences. How wide-ranging are the symptoms that they are still experiencing?
Very wide-ranging and very similar to what we see in ME/CFS. There's some very unusual, like losing sense of smell and taste, but many of the symptoms, the fog, the fatigue, sleep difficulties are very comparable. What we think is there's really two groups. One group has organ difficulties, either cardiac or lung. Other groups don't have those. And they still have persistent symptoms. And what Tony Komaroff at Harvard suggests is up to 50 to 80% of COVID patients have lingering symptoms. Some other individuals have suggested it might be up to about 10% have prolonged symptoms. But if 10% of 7 million people have prolonged symptoms in this long haul group, that's a significant public health challenge.
Mercedes Carnathon, about how debilitating are some of these symptoms? I mean, extreme exhaustion, brain fog, is this interrupting their lives?
Absolutely. The anecdotal stories that we're hearing from these individuals who have suffered long-term from post-COVID illness and syndromes include brain fog, extreme tiredness and exhaustion, shortness of breath. You can imagine that those interfere with an individual's ability to get back to their life and get back to work. And so the prolonged nature of these symptoms are going to lead to prolonged decrements in individuals' quality of life.
In July, Dr. Anthony Fauci said that there is some evidence that the long haul symptoms resemble those of chronic fatigue syndrome. Leonard, briefly, what is that syndrome and how does it relate to what long haulers are experiencing?
So chronic fatigue syndrome, we call it ME/CFS, less stigmatizing term, is basically something when you get some type of trigger, like COVID-19. Most frequently it's mono, which is caused by the Epstein-Barr virus. And after that, you go from relatively well functioning to having significant limitations in lifestyle, such that it's hard to work, it's hard to maintain household responsibilities. There's difficulties with work, social environment, family relationships. The three most common symptoms are really very comparable to COVID-19. Things like fatigue, we actually call it post-exertional malaise, which is probably a more technical term. You try to do something and you feel sick after it. Not just fatigue, but sick. The cognitive impairment, fog you mentioned, and sleep difficulties. Those are the most common symptoms. And if they occur for at least 6 or more months, they transition into what's called this ME/CFS state.
And Mercedes, we're less than a year into the virus, about 7 months. Do we have enough information to know the long-term effects of this?
We really don't. And you highlight where we need to go, the direction we need to go. We don't know necessarily who is going to contract the virus and have their symptoms resolve quickly. We don't know who is going to have very mild symptoms but end up with this post-COVID fatigue and long hauler syndrome. What we need are more long-term studies, and I'm so pleased to hear that Dr. Jason is working in this area, because we need to follow these individuals to see what happens and what some of the triggers are for a return to normal, just as we need as much information up front about those individuals who are suffering long-term symptoms so that we can aggregate those data and try to identify the patterns of individuals who are likely to have significant long-term effects.
Now, roughly 6 months after diagnosis, we just heard from one long hauler at the top of the story. Jamie Novick says that she's beginning to feel better. Here's a bit of what she says.
I'm able to do some things, like I can have a day where I might actually have most of the day might be kind of a good day. Not saying I'm not having no symptoms, but, I'm getting through it and everything, a little bit more optimistic and everything, a little bit more energy.
Now, other long haulers have also reported noticing some improvement after 6 months. Leonard, could that be a turning point for most patients?
Very, very much could. And I think the key thing is not to overdo it, because as you start getting some recovery, it's very easy to kind of want to go right back into the lifestyle one had. And that is not a good thing. So I would say take it slow and stay, what we call it in the MECF world is sort of pacing, staying within your energy envelope. Push it a little bit, but don't really go back to your old lifestyle immediately because you can have a relapse.
Mercedes, we've got just a few seconds left. You know, similar to the virus itself, there are many different symptoms that long haulers are experiencing. Does that make it more difficult for doctors to treat and identify?
Absolutely, and that's the frustration that we hear anecdotally from these long haulers. They go to their doctor, they say, hey, I'm having these symptoms, and the doctors are looking at the early symptom checklist we have, and we say, well, there shouldn't be hair loss, that can't be it. And quite often, individuals are shuttled into psychological services as if it's all in their mind, when really there is a model for these post-viral fatigue syndromes, and these patterns have been seen in other conditions. And so the extent to which physicians can take this seriously and document what they're hearing, we can start to identify the patterns.
Okay, a lot we still don't know. My thanks to Leonard Jason and Mercedes Carnathon. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Almost everyone enjoys music, whether you're listening to it or performing it yourself. But music education programs often end up on the chopping block of school budgets. When one music teacher had her program cut from a charter school in East Garfield Park, she refused to quit on the kids in the community, the underserved community that she worked in. Chicago Tonight's Evan Garcia checked out the nonprofit Bandwidth to learn more.
15-year-old Jamarcus Allen is a student instructor for a newly formed drum line on Chicago's west side.
I'm one of the leaders on the drum line, so I get to show kids, you know, what sticks to use, how to use them, and like what instruments to play.
14-year-old Justin Rucker is picking up the drums pretty quickly.
Today actually will make 1 year for me playing drums. 12 when I was first introduced to the drum line. I didn't know how to play the drums, but then as I met some friends, they showed me how to do it. In like 2 weeks, I was already knowing all the beats and how to do everything.
The drumline is part of Bandwidth, a nonprofit offering free music instruction to students at Hope Junior, an after-school program at Marillac St. Vincent Family Services in the East Garfield Park neighborhood.
Go ahead.
Teacher Anna Palomino started Bandwidth in 2015 when her music program was eliminated from the budget of Learn Charter School, located across the street.
At that very moment, I just really didn't want to leave, you know, which I think is a big part of it, is just sticking around. If you've decided that this is what the community deserves, you know, every year my goal is to stay put and just to offer more music to more kids.
To help sustain the free program at Hope Junior, Palomino runs pay-for-participation music programs in 3 Chicago Catholic schools.
The ukuleles I do give them because they're so affordable. If you were a student taking lessons like Jeremiah, then you are given a guitar and a book to keep at home to practice. And then, you know, for as long as you're in the program and as long as you're interested.
15-year-old Jeremiah Bell is a few months into his guitar lessons.
She ended up giving it to me so I can practice at home. So it's real cool that I can go home and show my mom and show like my friends what I learned from here.
Now, some of us may have taken our school's band programs for granted, but these days, Anna says access to musical instruction and band programs is a rarity in Chicago's public school system.
If you do have a band program in a city school, it's because the parents are paying for it. So that means the parents have to be able to afford paying for it. Most schools are not paying for their band program or the salary of their band instructor. It really is not common at all anymore. But it did used to be pretty common, you know, in the Chicago public schools, even just a generation back. So I just think we got to get back to that.
A recent report by the arts education nonprofit Ingenuity found approximately 35% of Chicago public school students lack access to consistent, high-quality arts education. Those students are disproportionately Black and economically disadvantaged.
I actually come here every day. Something about the drumline, how it brings a bunch of kids together who might not know each other, and like just doing different events is like very fun.
For Chicago Tonight, this is Evan Garcia.
Anna says she's the only primary instructor teaching roughly 80 students in Bandwidth's paid programs and 65 students in free lessons. She does recruit visiting musicians to provide instruction as well. And now, Paris, we go back to you.
All right, Brandis, thank you very much. And still to come on Chicago Tonight, CVS is hiring thousands of workers for flu season. How many new hires is Chicago expecting? That and more business headlines from Cranes. State Senator Jim Oberweis on his campaign to unseat Democratic incumbent Lauren Underwood in the 14th Congressional District. Critics are making the most of their once-in-a-decade chance to toss a sitting Illinois Supreme Court justice off the court. And what exactly is the QAnon conspiracy theory brought up in President Trump's town hall last week? But first, some more of today's top stories. Governor Pritzker announced that Southern Illinois Region 5 will roll back some of the COVID-19 guidelines, and Region 7 and 8, which includes 4 Chicago area counties, including DuPage and Kane, could be next for pandemic restrictions.
Starting Thursday, Region 5 will move to increased mitigations, including the temporary closure of indoor dining and indoor bar service, and a reduction of group gatherings to 25 people. Both Regions 7 and 8 have surpassed a rolling average of 8% and could join Region 5 in meeting the metrics for heightened mitigations as soon as tomorrow.
Some insight into how Mayor Lightfoot plans to close a $1.2 billion budget deficit. Sources confirmed to WTTW News the mayor's budget proposal is expected to include hundreds of layoffs and a $94 million property tax hike. That number was first reported by the Chicago Tribune. Here's what the mayor had to say about it when asked to confirm this.
The enormity of this budget gap requires us to look at a number of different options. We always look internally first. We can't go to taxpayers and ask them for more, and we pretend that the status quo, turning the size of the budget, the way in which we deliver services, that's all fine and can't be touched. We've got to look internally first to earn the trust of the taxpayers.
And now we toss it back to Brandis for some of today's top business headlines. Brandis.
Paris, thank you. American Airlines says it's bringing the Boeing 737 MAX planes back into service. Meanwhile, the airline industry reaches a milestone, carrying more than 1 million passengers in a day for the first time in 7 months. And CVS begins a hiring binge. Here to go behind the headlines is Crane Chicago business editor Ann Dwyer. And Ann, we all remember the Boeing 737 MAX planes. They've been grounded since March 2019 after 2 separate crashes killed more than 300 people. But now American Airlines says that it's bringing them back. Is this worrisome at all?
That's the multi-billion-dollar question, Brandis. Of course, the FAA is expected to say that the plane is safe to fly again. What Boeing and American Airlines are hoping is that the flying public agrees. Right now, with travel being down, depressed pretty significantly, I think American figures that this is a good time to ease the 737 MAX back into service. They expect to do so in December, pending FAA approval. But of course, we don't get to choose what type of plane we fly when we book a flight. And that's sort of part of the mix here. I think the airlines have a lot of work to do to reassure the flying public that when the 737 MAX is fully back in service, it's safe. For now, they're going to test it on the New York to Miami route.
So also in the airline industry, it reached a milestone this weekend after processing more than 1 million passengers in a day for the first time in 7 months. Is the industry on track to getting back up to pre-pandemic levels?
Well, this is an important milestone, to be sure, but I think it's important to remember that even having hit this 1 million passenger mark that they did the other day, we're still 40% down of passenger levels from October of last year. So it's a significant fall off, as encouraging as this is. I think that just last week, United Airlines CEO Scott Kirby warned Wall Street that he doesn't expect to see business-related travel return to pre-COVID levels at United until August of 2024. And that prediction really rocked Wall Street because it's farther out than a lot of other people have articulated. And also business travel is just the bread and butter of airlines of the scope of American and United.
Yeah, it's an important point. So also CVS is adding 15,000 jobs to help with flu season and the coronavirus. How many of those jobs are going to be in Chicago, and what kind of jobs are we talking about?
The company is saying they'll be bringing 250 people here locally. Most of these jobs are pharmacy technicians, and these are people who've just recently been authorized by federal officials to administer vaccines. And of course, that's going to be wildly important once vaccines are available, that they'll be able to help out in administering not only COVID-19 vaccines, but also cold and flu vaccines, all of which are expected to be in heavy demand in the coming season.
Absolutely. Okay, our thanks to Ann Dwyer at Crane Chicago Business. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And now back to Paris and a state senator running for Congress in the 14th Congressional District. Paris.
Brandis, as mentioned earlier, Illinois and much of the country is experiencing a new surge in coronavirus cases. This as President Trump has called for states to do away with economic restrictions designed to slow the spread. Amid this environment, our next guest is running as the Republican candidate for Congress in the 14th District, which stretches from the western and northern suburbs of Chicago to the Wisconsin border. And joining us now is State Senator Jim Oberweis, Republican candidate for Congress in the 14th District, where he is hoping to unseat Democratic incumbent Lauren Underwood. We should also note that Underwood declined our invitation to be part of this discussion tonight. But State Senator Jim Oberweis, we're glad you're here. We'll start very simply. Why you and not another term for Representative Underwood?
Well, look, I've lived in this district my whole life. I've been in the same house for the last 43 years, as a matter of fact. I believe I understand the needs and the interests and the desires of people in this district. Unfortunately, my opponent doesn't seem to represent the people at all. She has voted 100% of the time, every bill, every vote, with Nancy Pelosi, not with the people of this district. And I think that's important that we have people who will represent our district, not the strict party line of Nancy Pelosi.
Obviously, the big issue facing your district and the entire state right now, COVID, another 4,200 cases announced today in Illinois, another surge in much of the country as 220,000 people already have died. What must Congress and the White House do to finally get a hold of this?
Well, obviously, there's no easy answer to that, and we're getting sometimes conflicting information. The real answer, of course, is to get a vaccine that works. I think we're very close. There are at least 3 vaccines in stage 3 testing, which means they could be approved anytime in the next 30 or 60 days. Once that, and they're already, by the way, producing millions of vials of the vaccine so that they will be ready to go as soon as the FDA says it's safe and effective. So I'm hoping that that will help to clear up the situation fairly quickly. It doesn't mean in the next 30 days. It's going to be certainly in the first quarter next year, but I think it's coming.
In the interim, should there be mask mandates and further restrictions on places like restaurants or clubs or bars?
Well, you're putting me in a difficult position because I happen Oberweis area has 9 restaurants in addition to the ice cream store, so you're making it tough on me. But look, I think the evidence is that when you're outdoors and socially distanced, masks clearly are not needed. But when you're indoors in close contact with other people for a prolonged period of time, masks do help to prevent the spread of the virus. So I think it does.
Does that mean there should be a mandate, or should that be up to the individual?
Well, I'm concerned about mandates. I will tell you that at Oberweis Dairy, we do require all of our employees to wear masks at all times, and we require our customers even to wear masks coming in. Now, if they're sitting at a table eating a burger or a pizza, obviously they can't, or even ice cream, they can't maintain a mask at that point. But when it comes to outside, I certainly don't think so. And I'm very, very concerned about mandating masks on people.
All right, let's listen to what President Trump had to say at a rally yesterday about this subject and about Dr. Tony Fauci.
If you vote for Biden, he will surrender your jobs to China. He will surrender your future to the virus. He's going to lock down. This guy wants to lock down. He'll listen to the scientists. If I listened totally to the scientists, we would right now have a country that would be in a massive depression.
All right, the president was referring to his opponent Biden, not Tony Fauci. But do you agree with the president there that he shouldn't totally listen to the scientists?
Well, we certainly have to listen to them, but sometimes they have only one part of the viewpoint. What is sometimes missed in this is that when we have this total lockdown, it tends to cause some deaths in other ways. The number of suicides has gone up significantly. We're certainly affecting the educational opportunities of our kids and the socialization of those kids. So when it comes to schools, I'm inclined to ask each individual school to make a decision as to what is safe for them. If they have a big enough room and they can get social distance, and for older kids, you can get them to wear masks. I believe that going to school is much better than trying to do it through Zoom. The educational results are better, the socialization is better, and we don't have the suicides. And the other thing that's happening is people are skipping healthcare checks, things like mammograms and skin cancer screenings, and we're having more deaths as a result of that. So there isn't an easy answer to this. We have to try to reach some type of reasonable balance between those two sides.
And there is the economic component. It does appear that further stimulus talks are on life support. The last time you were here, you said you supported a plan to have government perhaps buy equity shares in troubled companies in industries like the airline industry. Do you support another round of direct payments to individuals and businesses from the government?
Well, there are obviously certain industries like air travel or hotels and motels that are very drastically impacted by the shutdown that has occurred. I think it does make sense to help them, to keep them alive. But I don't think it's bad necessarily to have the government in return for low interest loans or equity, either buy equity or provide perhaps a warrant that would allow the companies to, or allow the government to be paid back a little bit.
How about payments to individuals?
I'm sorry?
How about payments to individuals?
Well, look, a lot of people are out there are hurting and hurting very badly. I think if we do this right, it is an opportunity to make payments to help with stimulus checks to individuals again. But what I don't think is right, my opponent has voted for providing $1,200 stimulus checks to every person here in this country illegally. I think we want to help our citizens who are here legally, but not necessarily those who are here illegally who've broken our laws.
Amid this, the White House right now is arguing a case to do away with the Affordable Care Act. What would you replace the Affordable Care Act with?
Look, you know, all this talk about repeal and replace it's a lot of politics. In my opinion, I don't care whether we repeal and replace it or we just fix it. The goal is to make healthcare more affordable and more available to more citizens in this country. And the keys to bringing that cost down, I think, are more competition and more transparency. And I believe that the president is moving in that direction, which I think is a big plus. He has issued an executive order to allow for the reimportation of American-made drugs from Canada to bring the cost of drugs down. He's an executive order to allow for interstate sales of insurance products. Again, more competition helps bring those costs down, and that's the right way to go.
Very quickly, the last question. You know, undocumented immigration has been a cause of yours through various campaigns that you've run. Do you support the Trump administration's policy over the last few years to separate children of undocumented immigrants from their parents at the border?
No, of course not, and I don't think he does either. He's using that as a little bit of a bargaining chip. I also support allowing a path to citizenship for those kids who were brought here illegally by their parents, who've grown up here, who consider themselves Americans. They should have a path to citizenship, because in this country, we don't hold kids responsible for mistakes that their parents made. But I don't really think that those parents who broke the law should be given a path to citizenship any different than anybody else. There is an opportunity for a non-immigrant visa, which would allow them to stay here legally and work, but not a path to citizenship.
Well, you're talking about DACA kids right now.
That everybody else follows.
But I'm talking about the border separation policy for people crossing the border.
No, we should stop them from even coming in the country to begin with. That's part of the idea of the wall.
All right. State Senator Jim Oberweis, we thank you very much for being here. Thank you.
Thank you.
And a reminder, his opponent, Congressman Lauren Underwood, declined our invitation to participate tonight. Our thanks once again to Jim Oberweis, and be sure to check out our WTTW News 2020 voter guide that offers special election coverage and details on specific races. There you can also search for candidates by race or district and hear from them in their own words. All these resources are available at WTTW.com/voter guide. And up next, Illinois Supreme Court Justice Thomas Kilbride's bid to remain on the court for another 10 years, so stick around.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by the City Club of Chicago.
Smart people may disagree about what makes a great city, but part of what makes Chicago great is that we don't have to agree. To run a city like ours, a lot of issues come up. The City Club of Chicago is a place to debate those issues and hear from the men and women who shape the policies, lead the industries, and tell the stories that define our city. For the free and open exchange of ideas, the City Club of Chicago.
The nation's eyes have been on Washington, D.C., as a Senate committee on Thursday is scheduled to officially vote on the confirmation of President Donald Trump's nominee, Judge Amy Coney Barrett, to the U.S. Supreme Court. But the makeup of the Illinois Supreme Court is also set to see turnover. How much depends on the outcome of a race that's getting more expensive and contentious by the day. Amanda Venicky joins us now with the story. Amanda.
Brandis, this isn't your typical race. There's no person running against Illinois Supreme Court Justice Thomas Kilbride as he seeks his third decade-long term. He nonetheless is facing major opposition to the point he could lose his seat. There's millions of dollars being spent on ads.
Meet Justice Tom Kilbride, Mike Madigan's favorite judge. For decades, Madigan's corrupt Chicago machine has rigged our entire government, including the Supreme Court.
Vote yes to retain Justice Tom Kilbride for integrity, independence, and fairness in our courts.
Kilbride represents the 3rd district. It is in blue on the map you should be seeing on your screen, but the outcome of this race does stand to have impact statewide, which is why the battle for retention is getting so much attention. The Illinois Chamber of Commerce accuses Kilbride of being cozy with personal injury attorneys who are helping to fund his campaign, and they say that hurts the state's business climate.
Think about your cost of auto insurance. Would you like it to be less or would you like it to be more? It's more because we've got a court system that will go ahead and be very, very plaintiff friendly.
Kilbride's detractors also say he's cozy with someone else, Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan.
It is clear if you look back when he was first elected, Michael Madigan put an awful lot of effort behind his election, and it was successful.
Now, Kilbride says that Madigan is not a factor in the court's deliberations, and he says he knows the speaker only casually, as he does other political figures from both parties.
We have no relationship beyond that casual kind of professional, distant relationship.
All judges, when he first ran for a seat on the bench, Kilbride had to declare a party. He ran and won as a Democrat, and as such, he had the backing of the Democratic Party of Illinois, helmed by Madigan. Democrats currently hold a 4-3 majority on the state Supreme Court, and they want to keep it. Republicans see taking out Kilbride as their chance to tip the judicial scales. Much of their criticism of Kilbride stems from a 2016 case in which hundreds of thousands of Illinois voters signed onto a petition that would change how legislative districts are drawn. Kilbride wrote the opinion for the majority that the effort was constitutionally flawed.
It was knocked off the ballot, all to protect one person and his power, and that's Mike Madigan. And so we were outraged, and now we have an opportunity to speak back and tell the public that we can do something about this outrage. We shouldn't have used the judicial system the way Tom Kilbride did in 2016.
Kilbride, that is, points out that decision was 4-3. It was not his opinion alone, and he says it was effectively chance that it was him that wrote the opinion. The judges are assigned on rotation.
We don't wear blue robes, we don't wear red robes, we wear a black robe to symbolize impartiality, and it's those individuals on the outside who are looking in, trying to politicize and make this a political contest, and that's bad for our judicial independence.
Kilbride says voters should consider his record. Also, that he helped make it legal for TV news cameras to record Illinois court proceedings. Also, he says they should check out his qualifications. He has the nod from the Illinois State Bar Association, also from some prominent Republicans, including retired Illinois Supreme Court Justice Bob Thomas.
I knew him to be a conscientious jurist. He asked pointed questions at oral argument. He was always prepared. All you have to do is look back at our opinions. We didn't always agree. I thought I was right. He thought he was right, but we didn't get those cases because they were easy. I think he's a man of integrity.
Come November 3rd, it will take 60% of voters in Kilbride's 3rd district to vote yes in order for him to retain his seat. Brandis, back to you.
Amanda, thank you. And up next, confused about what QAnon is? We'll explain. But first, a look at the weather.
From anonymous fringe websites to the presidential stage, the conspiracy theory QAnon has cracked into mainstream discourse. The theory is labeled a domestic terrorist threat by the FBI and has led to kidnappings and killings. So what is QAnon and why does law enforcement consider it to be so dangerous? Joining us to talk more on the conspiracy theory is David Goldenberg, the Midwest Regional Director at the Anti-Defamation League. David Goldenberg, thanks for being here. We only have a few minutes, so I'm going to get right into it. What is QAnon?
Thanks for having me, Paris. QAnon is a wide-reaching right-wing conspiracy theory that has been embraced, as I said, by a number of conservative activists, by supporters of President Trump. And at its core, the conspiracy is that the world governments, including the United States, is run by a shadowy cabal of pedophiles who President Trump will ultimately bring to justice. We've seen them at a number of conservative rallies, political rallies, and others. And as you mentioned, it has been labeled by the FBI as a domestic terrorist threat. Throughout, it embraces sort of wide-ranging, sort of generally known conspiracy theories, but also with a marked undertone of anti-Semitism and xenophobia.
All right, so with conspiracy theories like this, you might have some true believers based on paranoia. You have some grifters who see some big bucks in manipulating people. Do we know who's behind this?
So no one quite knows who's behind it. But what we do know, though, is that there are too many people who have frankly sought to kind of give it life or credence or credibility in a number of ways, whether it be elected officials, public leaders who have sort of embraced these conspiracies and ultimately have driven it, and it's now found its way into sort of mainstream conservative views. And ultimately, we've seen it play out on the campaign trail throughout 2020.
Right, and one of those moments was at the town hall featuring President Trump last Thursday. Let's hear how he addressed that question.
Let me just tell you, what I do hear about it is they are very strongly against pedophilia, and I agree with that. I mean, I do agree with that, and I agree with it very strongly.
But there's not a satanic pedophile cult being
no
run
idea.
by.
I know nothing
You don't know
about
that? Okay.
No, I don't know
You
that.
just
and
this
neither
week.
do you know that.
Okay.
So this has been the president's messaging strategy on this. It echoes the messaging strategy from two congressional candidates in Illinois, both Republicans. One of them, Philonise White, tweeted a common QAnon hashtag, "Where we go one, we go all," but then says, well, I don't know anything about this. So how do QAnon adherents react to sort of this I don't know about it, but then sort of kind of tangentially kind of giving them a little, playing footsie with them, basically?
I think the first thing is that when it comes to elected officials, especially the President of the United States and people running for Congress, ignorance is not an acceptable answer. This is a conspiracy theory that has been well documented, been well reported on throughout this entire election cycle and even before. And one of the things and the reason that the FBI has called this a domestic terrorist threat is because those who ascribe to these views, who truly believe in it, have taken to violence and other actions. And we're talking about murders, we're talking about kidnapping, We're talking about domestic assault. We're talking about somebody putting an armored truck in front of the Hoover Dam. All who are believing that they're stopping this sort of shadowy cabal of pedophiles within the government from doing bad things. So we're not talking about a logical argument. We're not talking about a reasonable beliefs. These are conspiracy theories with no element of truth whatsoever, but are inspiring people in many cases to take action in a violent way, but then also giving a wink and a nod to those who sort of want to push, whether it be anti-Semitism, xenophobia, or other isms and obias that get built into it. I mean, after all, who's against pedophilia? David, but the reality is that we're deeply concerned about the way that QAnon has made its way into sort of modern politics or into everyday politics.
And part of that, we only have a few seconds, part of that has been through social media. Has Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, have they successfully cracked down on some of these groups?
So a lot of the platforms have made strong statements. And many of them have actually pulled down accounts. ADL has been working with them and other groups and organizations, and we applaud that. But the reality is that they need to do more. There's still too many elements of QAnon and these types of conspiracy theories that are playing out on social media platforms, and they've been incredible contributors to the manifestation of these types of conspiracy theories. And now it's incumbent upon social media platforms to do everything that they can to take them down.
All right, David Goldenberg, we have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And that is our show for this Monday night. Please join us tomorrow night live at 7. And now for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Paris Schutz.
And I'm Brandis Friedman. Thank you for watching. Stay healthy and safe and have a good night.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a Chicago personal injury and wrongful death firm that is proud of their attorneys selected for the 2020 Illinois Super Lawyers List.